Hello again. As you know, I am Eli, the computer guy, and today's class is Introduction to Active Directory Infrastructure in Windows Server 2012. So we are going to be talking about the critical infrastructure within a Windows Server 2012 environment. Now, I want to make sure, and I'm going to bang this into your guys' heads today, that you understand we are talking about the Windows environment. We're talking about the sysadmin environment. So today we're going to be talking about domain controllers, client computers, DNS, DHCP, sites, replication, those types of things. Now, when I'm talking about this type of Windows Server infrastructure, I am not talking about Cisco equipment. I'm talking about routers. I'm not talking about modems. I'm not talking about switches. I'm not talking about any of that. Right now, we are simply in the Microsoft Windows Server 2012 world. We're not worrying about Cisco equipment. As far as we are concerned today, the data networking components are already set up, they are already functioning, they are not our responsibility. So a lot of times when people start talking about infrastructure, you assume that we're talking about routers or switches or modems or AdTrans or any of that kind of stuff. Today we are not talking about that. We feel that the data networking layer is solid, it's secure, it is not our responsibility. We're only talking about the Windows Server 2012 Active Directory infrastructure. Now, this class, again, as I talk about with all classes, I'm pulling a lot of information out of this Windows Server 2012 Unleashed by SAMS. Again, I'm going to put a lot of time and effort into creating this learning track for you for Windows Server 2012, but to put it frankly, this is a lot of material right now. It's in your best interest to go out and pick up a copy of either the SAMS version of this book or some other vendor's version of the Windows Server 2012 book, because there's a lot of information in these that I simply cannot go over unless I literally sit here and read into a camera for hours on end, and I'm just not going to do that. You can pick one of these up for about $60 at Barnes & Noble. So basically, we are going to be talking about the Active Directory infrastructure today. So remember, I talked about Active Directory before. What is Active Directory? Active Directory are the security services for a Microsoft Windows network. Active Directory is the server service that allows you to create things like user accounts, allows you to create things like computer accounts, allows permissions, allows security. It ties users and computers together. That is what Active Directory does. So make sure you remember that as we're going forward into the track. Again, the big thing, what makes Microsoft Windows environments so good, so wonderful, so great, is this Active Directory security that allows you to easily administer hundreds or thousands of servers and thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of client computers. Again, when we're thinking about things like Active Directory, you've got to get out of your mindset of thinking about 5 computers or 10 computers or a big company being 100 computers. We're talking about companies that have 300,000 employees. How do you administer those systems? How do you secure those systems? With Active Directory, you are able to do it relatively easily. So today we're going to be talking about that infrastructure. So this is going to be a big whiteboard class. We don't have any practical stuff yet. It's all going to be on the whiteboard. So let's go over to the whiteboard now so I can start explaining to you guys how this stuff in Active Directory works. So we're talking about the infrastructure. We're talking about the different computers and servers we are going to be using in this Microsoft Windows Server environment. Now, one of the things that really confuses people when you start dealing with Microsoft servers is so many different types of servers are built into the Windows Server operating system. You can get very confused and not realize that they're all are individual things. So if you buy Server 2012, you go to newegg.com and you buy the OEM version or whatever. Oops, I've got these stink bugs around here that are just horrible. Sorry about that. But you go to, let's say, newegg.com and you buy a $600 version of Windows Server 2012. When you get that operating system, it is going to have Active Directory built in. But it's also going to have something called IIS, Internet Information Services, built in. It will also have routing and remote access, allows you to create a VPN server. All of that is built in to the package. So one of the things when you're thinking about such as Active Directory is you have to separate out what all of these different components and server services are and really just focus on whatever it is you are working on at the moment. So we're talking about Active Directory today. So with Active Directory, we talked about before, is we have these things called DCs or domain controllers. These are the Active Directory servers. These are the servers that hold the database with all the information about the computers and the users on the network. Those are called DCs. You then have client computers. So client computers are the Windows 8 computers, Windows 7 computers, Windows XP Pro, Windows Vista Business Edition. These are the computers that connect to the DC and become members of the domain. So this is a domain controller. So the domain is all the computers and all the servers on the network that are part of this one logical domain. So all of the security policies, all the user groups, all of that, you add client computers and servers to the domain by connecting them to the domain controller. That's what creates the domain. Now, since we're now in 2012, we like redundancy, right? So back in the day, way back when I started doing computers and technology back in 1999, we didn't have a lot of redundancy. We used to have something called PDCs and BDCs, and they were a real pain in the butt. Well, now we simply have what are called domain controllers. So one of the questions that you have is if we're dealing with an environment that has thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of users, do you really want to rely on one single DC or domain controller to do all of the authentication for all of those different computers, users, and servers on the network? Well, no, you don't, because if one DC fails, one domain controller fails, it means basically your entire network stops working. That's not a good idea. So what you can do now in the Server 2012 world, and actually this goes all the way back to the Server 2000 world, is you can add multiple domain controllers to the domain. So I can have, let's say, 4 different DCs here. And if one fails, or if one is getting hammered too hard by too many users, you can have fault tolerance and load balancing off of all of these different domain controllers. This is called clustering. Because again, what is the domain controller doing? The domain controller houses the database for all of the computers and users. So when you have databases, you can do clustering, which means you combine multiple servers into one cluster, so that if there's a problem with one DC or domain controller, the other 3 or 4 or 20 DCs are working just fine, and all of your computers can all of your users can log onto the network and get all of the services that they need. So this is the important thing. So domain controllers are what deal, when you sit down at a computer and you log in to the network, to the domain, you're connecting to the DC. The client computer has to be added to the domain, and then once it is, when you log in, you'll be directed to the domain controller, and hopefully on your network you have multiple domain controllers, and this is a cluster of the domain controllers. Now, one of the issues that's going to be coming up is what you have to be thinking about is, okay, so if we got 4 DCs here, we've got 4 domain controllers. Now, what happens if we have all these users, and user 1 connects to the first domain controller, and let's say he changes his password. And user 2 connects to the 4th domain controller, and he changes his password. Well, now you're thinking, well, there's 4 different domain controllers here. How does domain controller 1 No, that password got changed on domain controller 4 and vice versa. Well, this happens through replication strategies. So replication strategies, or replication, is how data is copied between all of these domain controllers. So the important thing when you're dealing with clusters and when you're dealing with domain controllers is that they all have the same information, that they all can be used. Because if information gets changed on the first domain controller, but it never gets changed on the fourth, then if somebody goes to log in, you're going to be having problems. So this is replication. And so whenever you have multiple domain controllers on your company, either LAN or WAN on the company network, they have to be able to replicate the data out to all the other domain controllers so that they all have the same information. So once we start talking about the replication, we start talking about sites. So sites are wherein the Active Directory consoles, you combine different domain controllers and say that they are at a particular site. So let's say you have a corporate office, and at that corporate office you've got, let's say, 10 domain controllers to make sure that everybody can access the domain controllers when they log in the morning. So you're going to your headquarters office, let's say there's 50,000 users there, so I don't know, let's just spitball and say you have 10 Active Directory domain controllers on that local network. Now when you do replication strategies, right, since they're all on that LAN, they're probably connected with gigabit network connectivity, they can replicate data very quickly amongst themselves. So what you would do is you would create that as, let's say, a headquarters site. So you would tie those domain controllers and call them a single site because they can replicate the data very quickly, right? Well, the question then happens, well, what if you have multiple what are called satellite offices? So here you've got 50,000 users, but then let's say you have these offices out in the out all over the country, and they all have 100 users. Well, one of the issues is, one of the things that you don't think about is when you go to log into a domain. So you sit at your computer, you type in your username and credentials, and that connects to the domain controller, and then your access control key is given back to you. That isn't very much data. That doesn't seem like very much data. But when you have lots of people, hundreds of people, or thousands of people all trying to connect to domain controllers, that can eat up a lot of bandwidth, right? Because you're logging in, your log information is sent to the domain controller, and then the domain controller sends you information back. On the LAN, the local area network, that doesn't seem like any big deal. But if you're dealing with internet connections, that login process can start to take up a lot of bandwidth. And so many times what you do is at these remote sites, you put in their own domain controllers, DCs, so that when the users here log in, they log into the local domain controller versus having to send all of that information over the network. So what you're going to have is you're going to have a domain controller generally at every satellite office that you're dealing with. Well, the question then is, what do we do? Because if this is a domain controller, just like this is a domain controller, and there's all of these changes happening, how do we make sure that the domain controllers have the same information, that replication goes on? Well, what we've done is we turn the headquarters into one site. We then turn these remote offices into their own sites. So let's say this is the Baltimore site, and this is the Philly site, and this is the Washington, D.C. site. So however many domain controllers we have at these sites, we combine them to create their own sites within the Active Directory configurations. So we have the headquarters site, and all of the computers, or the Active Directory servers on this site are connected to that site, that headquarters site. Then at every remote office, we create them as their own sites, and any domain controllers that are there, we add them to that site within the Active Directory environment. And then what we say is we tell it what the replication strategy will be. So if you are at the headquarters site, within the site on this LAN, the replication will generally happen in real time or almost real time. All of these servers will be replicating to each other, and they will all be completely in sync, generally within a couple of minutes of each other. Well, if you're having to send data over the internet connection and you don't want to bog down the internet connection with all that replication, what you can do is you can set a time or a replication strategy. So when will the data replicate? Will it replicate every 5 minutes or every 1 hour or once a day? So you can say that once a day at 1 a.m. in the morning, the data will replicate out to all of these different sites. So generally, if you're dealing with small sites where not a lot of changes happen, this will work a-okay. So this is the idea of sites. And within Active Directory, you configure these different sites, and you say, you know, what servers, what Active Directory servers are in the sites, and then what you'll be doing is you'll be saying what the replication strategy is to replicate the data between all of these Active Directory servers. Now these connections here are called site links. So the connection between the headquarters site and the DC site is called a site link. The connection between the headquarters site and the Philadelphia site is a site link. This is called a site link. So it's how the sites connect together. Now the next thing with the sites is that there is something called a site link bridgehead. This is important because remember, with all of this Active Directory synchronization going on, we have to try to make sure that there's the greatest possibility that the synchronization will happen. That if there's a single point of failure in, let's say, the network, that the synchronization will still go on. So with these Active Directory sites, you can make them what are called bridgeheads. What that means is if these sites are connected through the network to each other as well as to the headquarters office, if something happens and the connection to the headquarters office fails, what a bridgehead allows is so the synchronization can go from the Baltimore office, then to the Philly office, and then back up to the headquarters office. Basically, what the bridgeheads allows is it allows for redundancy. So if one connection fails, it can use another. The servers can use different servers on the network to try to be able to do the replication in the future. So some of this gets a little fuzzy, but basically this is the idea with sites. So you have sites, then you have site links, then you have bridgeheads. So to allow, like I say, if one link in this connection fails, they can still do all of this replication. So that's the basic idea with sites, site links, and site link bridgeheads. Now, some of the other things that you have to think about is, let's say you have the headquarters office here and you have these other remote offices. Now generally, the domain controllers will be what are called read-write. What read-write means is if I go to log in to a domain controller, I will be able to put in my username and password. It will go to the domain controller, it will check to see if my username and password are correct, and if they're correct, it will allow me access to the domain. That is called a read. The reason it's a read is because you're giving the server your username and password that have already been created, and all it is doing is verifying that the username and password are correct. So that's a read. Well, then you have what is called a write. So a write with the domain controller means that you can make changes to that particular domain controller. So let's say you want to change your password. So you log in with a domain controller, then you say, I want to change my password, and you change the password. When you change the password, then what it's doing is it's writing that new password to the database on that domain controller. So if you want to be able to add users, if you want to change passwords, if you want to change usernames, basically the domain controller has to be both read and write. So one of the things you can do from a security perspective is you have these remote sites, and all of these remote sites have their domain controllers. But what's the big problem? Well, here you have the headquarters building, and in the headquarters building, you've got a lot of security, right? Headquarters building, you got armed guards, you got barbed wire fences, you've got geeks with like knives that can slice you in half if you try to hack their systems, right? In the headquarters, you've got a lot of security. The most secure place in any company is going to be the headquarters building, no matter how sad that security may actually be in the real world. Now the problem is, out at the remote sites is always going to be the worst level of security, right? Because you've got 100 users, if you got 1,000 users, you got 5 users. And frankly, management, the C-levels, the CEO and so forth, when they look at these remote offices, they don't want to pay a lot of money for security. So the problem is if you have these domain controllers sitting at these remote offices with read-write ability, what happens if a hacker can get into this office, hack into the domain controller at the office, make changes, and if you have read-write ability, so they're able to write to this domain controller, well, whenever the replication strategy happens, that information will get replicated throughout the network. And now, because they were able to compromise your one little remote site that the CEO didn't care about, they are now able to sit at their computer and hack into the headquarters system. The reason being is because they hacked in to, let's say, the domain controller here for this one site. Let's say they gave themselves a user account with a VPN access. Well, that user account with VPN access now gets replicated out to all the other servers on the network. So now the hacker can sit at home, use the VPN access to create a VPN connection with the headquarters, and now try to do all kinds of hacking. So the problem is a lot of people put read-write domain controllers at all of their remote offices. So if a hacker gets in, they're able to write to that local domain controller, and then that information gets replicated out throughout the network. So one of the things that you can do with the Active Directory infrastructure is you can create read-only domain controllers. So you put read-only domain controllers at these satellite offices. So when users go to log in, all of their credentials are stored at these read-only domain controllers, so they're able to log in. But if somebody tries to hack in and make any modifications to the domain controller, they're not able to, because the domain controller is in read-only mode, so you simply can't make any modifications to it. So that's one of the things to think about when you're thinking about this Active Directory infrastructure, is you have read-write domain controllers, but then at the satellite offices you can have read-only domain controllers. The other thing that you have to be thinking about with domain controllers is something called global catalogs. Global catalogs are basically indexes of the all of the data stored within the domain controllers. So the user accounts and the computer accounts. Because again, remember, when we're talking about Active Directory, what are we talking about? We are talking about a database. Database controls and holds information, right? So the question about, what computers on the network, what users are on the network, how you access those computers and users, that's all stored within the database. If you just simply dump that database, if you just have that database with no indexes, it will take forever for any computer on the network to be able to find any information. So whenever you're dealing with any kind of database, you always create something called indexes. These allow you to search the database very, very quickly. In the Microsoft Active Directory world, the indexes are called the global catalog. So what happens is at every single site, you should have one of these global catalogs. Again, this is something that you just set up on the Active Directory server, and what it does is it indexes the Active Directory information so that when users go to search for something, that they're able to find it very quickly. So global catalog is, you have to have that installed on at least one server per site that you're dealing with. Now, when we're talking about Active Directory infrastructure, so we've talked about the domain controllers, we've talked about the client computers, the member computers, we've talked about sites, site links, site link bridgeheads, global catalogs. One of the things to remember is, again, in the Microsoft world, Windows world, Microsoft likes to control everything. And if Microsoft can't control everything, you can have a lot of weird problems. So part of the whole Active Directory infrastructure that you should have, that you should make Windows Microsoft have control over is DNS, Domain Name Services server. So basically, you guys are probably used to DNS. Maybe you go up onto the internet and you change something for your website, or on your local network at home, you make a few modifications. Well, Microsoft Windows Server 2012 DNS basically, this is light years ahead of the DNS that you're dealing with when you're dealing with your little Linksys router at home. The DNS for Windows Server 2012 does a lot more than that little Linksys DNS server that you have sitting at your house, and so you should have Microsoft take care of DNS for your network. One of the important things is, remember, what does DNS do? DNS maps names, fully qualified domain names, to IP addresses. So if you're worried about security, you want to try to make sure that nobody can hack your DNS and cause all kinds of problems on your network. Start pointing users to incorrect servers and all that. So with Windows Server 2012 DNS, they have things like reverse DNS that maps IP addresses to names. So normally when you're dealing with DNS, you map the name, the fully qualified domain name, to an IP address. Well, with Microsoft Server 2012, you also map the IP address to the domain name to make sure that everything matches. With the DNS, there's something called dynamic DNS. What that means is when a DHCP address is given out by a Microsoft Server 2012 server, that DNS is automatically updated. So when you're dealing with Active Directory, theoretically you can use a different DNS server, but I would highly suggest that you use Microsoft's DNS server. Now there is something, when you read the book, you're going to see something that frankly I haven't seen in the real world for a long time, but you should realize that it might exist. Something called a WINS server. So remember way back when Microsoft was trying to take over the world, well, DNS is the open source standard that everybody went with for mapping domain names to IP addresses. Well, way back in the 90s, Microsoft wanted to try to control mapping names to IP addresses, and so they came up with WINS, which was a competitor to DNS. WINS was Windows Internet Naming Service, and I don't know, I saw a couple of the servers up and running way back when, but it was way back when. But something that you should realize is if you have very old legacy systems, well, I'm talking really legacy systems, like literally these things have been running since like 1996, that you may have to set up WINS. All you have to realize about WINS is that it was Microsoft's like competitive version of DNS, and that nobody uses it anymore. But if you read the books and you learn about WINS, just realize it did exist, and they only talk about it because maybe, possibly, slightly, there's a chance that you have a computer on your network that was installed back in 1996. The final thing when we're talking about this Active Directory infrastructure is you should have Microsoft server deal with the DHCP. So DHCP is what gives out the IP addresses to all of the different computers on the network that use dynamic IP addresses. Again, the reason that you should use Microsoft's is because it plays nice in the Microsoft environment. If you use other DHCP servers, you may have all kinds of problems. The benefit of using Microsoft DNS and DHCP is not only will it play nicer with the Windows Microsoft server environment, but you can also have redundancy and fault tolerance. So you can have multiple DNS servers and multiple DHCP servers, just like you have multiple domain controllers. And again, if one of them fails, or two of them fails, or three of them fails, or whatever, as long as you still have one running, the rest of the network will keep going. Again, this is something that you really have to start thinking about once you start thinking about larger networks. Again, when we're talking about large networks, we're not even talking about 1,000 users. We're talking about 10,000 users, 100,000 users. You can't rely that one DHCP server is just going to be running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, forever, and that it's never going to fail. You always have to have some kind of redundancy, so if the DHCP and the DNS fails, that you're not going to have any issues. Because again, you know, having 10 users not being able to get on the network, sucks. having 10,000 users not be able to get on the network, then you have a catastrophe, and then you're probably getting fired if that happens in the real world. So these are the basic concepts that you should understand for Active Directory infrastructure. Again, we are not talking about Cisco or Juniper or SonicWall. We're not talking about the data network layer of the network. We are talking about the actual servers here. So you have the domain controllers that house the database for all of the Active Directory information. You can turn them into clusters so that they replicate the information so that you have fault tolerance and load balancing. When you cluster them on a local area network, you turn them into a site. If you have domain controllers off on remote sites, you turn them into different sites so that the replication strategy, you can determine how often the data should be replicated. Again, the bridgehead, as we talked about, so this is a site link. So when you have two sites connected, that's called a site link. A bridgehead is if you have multiple site links and then one fails, that replication can go through a different route. Kind of think like site link bridgeheads almost as like a routing protocol for replication of this Active Directory information. Then remember, whenever you have these remote sites, if you don't have good security at these remote sites, you can put read-only domain controllers there. That means users can log in and get all of their information, but they can't write to that domain controller. So it's a security thing. Then you have the global catalog. This is the index of the Active Directory database. You have these indexes to make it faster, so when you're trying to search for something on the network, if you don't have an index, it will take a long time. If you have these indexes, it will go rather quickly. And so every single site, you should have one of those global catalogs. Then we talked about DNS. Again, we will talk about DNS a lot more, and DHCP. The big thing to remember with DNS and DHCP in the Microsoft server environment is unless there's a really, really good reason to use something else, just use Microsoft's. I'm telling you, doing this stuff in the real world, once you've decided to use Microsoft, just stick with Microsoft. Microsoft plays very well with Microsoft. Microsoft doesn't always play well with other things. If you don't use Microsoft Windows Server 2012 DNS and DHCP, you could have problems in the future. So I would say just use it. One of the good points with using it, again, is you can have the fault tolerance. So you can have multiple DHCP servers, multiple DNS servers. If one fails, you still have that functionality on the network, very good thing. And the final thing is WINS, Windows Internet Naming Service. You will probably see this in the books, and it's archaic, and it's legacy, and in all the times I've been doing this, I mean, it's been the 90s since I saw WINS. WINS is one of those things that basically failed from day one, but Microsoft was big and powerful enough that a few people went with it, like way back 12 years ago, but by now you should never see WINS, but there is a possibility that you could see WINS. So this is the idea of what we're dealing with the infrastructure. So yeah, I mean, that's it. Basically, you have to start grasping these concepts before we can really go in and start making configurations and making changes in building domain controllers and all of that. Because the big problem that I see with a lot of the new people is that they simply don't understand what is trying to be accomplished. Nobody sits down and really explains to them what the hell Active Directory is. They just rush in to creating organizational units and sites and doing all this stuff, replication strategy. But you, as a student, you're like, well, but what's a site? What? Again, really for you guys to go forward and learn, whether it's Windows Server or whether it's Cisco, I really want you guys to take the time and energy to try to figure out what the end result is supposed to be. Don't worry about the configurations. Don't worry about the servers. Don't worry about any of that. Try to understand what is supposed to be accomplished. And then when you understand what is supposed to happen and why, then pick up the book and figure out the configurations and take the classes to learn what to do. Again, what I see is way too many people, they know how to create organizational units and sites and replication strategies and all that stuff, but they have no idea why anybody would use it in the real world, and therefore it's really, really hard to learn, especially for like certification tests. If you want to go out and get certified, if you don't really grasp why it is you're doing whatever it is you're doing, it's very difficult to remember what you're supposed to do because you don't really have a context for it, and it's a bit of a mess. Again, I'm not getting paid a dime by Sam's. I really should be getting paid, but I'm not. But you guys really do. The further we go into this, you need to pick up a book, whether it's Sam's or whether it's something else, because there's just so much information that I am not going to be able to get to. Now, one of the things, as I do these classes, I publish them to YouTube as soon as I'm finished, and then I immediately start getting feedback. Now, one of the pieces of feedback that I've gotten from a lot of you guys is there's this thought that, what was it somebody said? That Microsoft is becoming more irrelevant, and therefore I should be teaching you guys Linux instead of Microsoft. And other people have asked me about, well, Microsoft isn't the only provider of Active Directory or directory services. There's OpenLDAP and eDirectory and even Samba 4 and all kinds of stuff. So why don't I teach you guys that? Well, the reason that I'm teaching you guys Windows Server 2012 and Windows and Microsoft Active Directory is because this is what is used predominantly in the real world. I really want you guys to understand that. You guys, most of you guys, are going out and you're going to try to get hired for jobs. When companies hire you, they want to hire people that are skilled in the technologies that they have, not in technology that they don't have. So if you go out and you start asking mid-size to large companies what runs their systems, what runs their network, dollars to donuts, it's going to be Microsoft Server. Whether it's Server 2012 or whether it's Server 2008 or 2003 or Active Directory all the way back to 2000, I'm going to tell you guys, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be Microsoft that runs their Active Directory environment. It's not going to be Samba 4. So, with you guys trying to go out and get jobs, the thing is, if you go and you get your MCSA or your MCSE or your MCITP, you get certified in Microsoft, then you can also learn like Samba 4 and OpenLDAP. And so if you go into a company and you say, I've got my MCSE plus I am an expert at Samba 4, that will be considered a bonus and it will be much more likely that you will get a job. If you walk in and you just say, I'm an expert at Samba 4, yeah, how many companies, how many companies just run Samba 4? So that's one of the big things. I know I've getting a lot of pushback and, oh, I should just be teaching you guys Linux. But I'm telling you, like it or hate it, I'm not here on the morals. It is a Microsoft world. You understand Microsoft, you get certified in Microsoft, you are far more likely to get a job. You can be an expert at Samba 4 and OpenLDAP, and just simply how many of those jobs are out there. I'm not saying that there's no jobs out there. I'm not saying it's impossible to get a job. But when you're going out, you're putting out resumes, you need to put food on the table, you need to pay your mortgage. I'm telling you, Microsoft is the one that is much more likely to get you a paycheck at the end of the day than the other stuff. So whether you're not, you guys like it, and that's just one of the things from the real world. That's what I try to give you guys here is even if you hate Microsoft, even if you never want to use Microsoft, even if you're totally you just believe in Linux and you think the entire world should be on Linux, well, learn Microsoft so you can get a job, so you can get into a company, and then once you're in the company, then you can start trying to move them in the Linux way. But you can only move companies if you've actually been hired for them, if you get what I'm saying. So, yeah. So, as you know, I'm Eli the Computer Guy. This was Introduction to Active Directory Infrastructure on Windows Server 2012. Again, this is the 4th or 5th class in this track. We're going to be having many more, and pretty soon we're going to be really getting into nuts and the bolts of how to configure Windows servers. But again, you have to understand what's going on. So make sure you understand these last few classes that I've taught, and if you don't grasp what I've told you, go out and get a book and make sure you understand what sites are, make sure you understand what organizational units are, make sure you understand the concept behind Active Directory, because if you understand those things, when we go in to do the configurations, it will be a lot easier because you'll understand what's supposed to be happening. So, as always, I enjoy teaching this class and look forward to seeing you at the next one.